As Jake and Chanty stepped into Velantis, a breathtaking spectacle unfolded before Chanty's eyes, a city so modern and advanced, its vibrancy was almost tangible. The bustling surroundings captivated her senses, leaving her momentarily spellbound. She hadn't imagined that beyond the endless desert stretching as far as her gaze could see, there lay a city of such grandeur. It felt as though she had been bewitched by the overwhelming magnificence of her surroundings. The buildings were unlike anything she had ever seen, their surfaces appearing as if sculpted from crystal or glass. It was a stark contrast to the outer world, where concrete dominated the architecture, with only doors and windows made of glass. Here in Velantis, everything shimmered and sparkled, structures entirely constructed of glass or crystal, catching and reflecting light in dazzling patterns. Chanty was speechless, her wide eyes absorbing the sights around her. Beside her, Jake observed her reaction with a soft smile as they walked, trailing an elven staff member who had greeted them at the city entrance. Behind them, the guardians strode with unwavering confidence, their posture and aura exuding power. It was clear from the reverent glances of the Velantis citizens that the 7 guardians were both recognized and respected. Their strides were long and purposeful, commanding attention. Jake held Chanty's hand, their fingers clasped tightly together as they followed the elven guide into a large building shaped like a beehive, its walls and even its floors made entirely of glass. Chanty's eyes roamed ceaselessly, drinking in the surroundings, though the guardians remained focused, their pace steady as they followed the elven staff. Eventually, they reached a room that was vast and almost entirely white. The space was expansive, its pristine brightness evoking a surreal atmosphere. Suddenly, the metallic items carried by those entering the room were pulled to the floor with a loud, synchronized clang as if drawn by an invisible magnetic force. The metallic cacophony echoed through the chamber, amplifying the tense atmosphere. Chanty's gaze darted around the room, taking in the presence of various beings whose appearances were unlike anything she had encountered before. The elven guide stopped to converse with David in a language Chanty couldn't understand, the alien sounds foreign yet melodic. After their brief exchange, the elven guide departed, leaving the guardians standing at attention, bodies alert, their senses sharp. Jake's grip on Chanty's hand tightened as her attention was drawn to a strange contraption resembling a large vacuum that began collecting the metal weapons scattered across the floor. Chanty and Jake exchanged glances, their unease mirrored in their expressions. Minutes later, a voice emerged from a speaker, its words unintelligible to Chanty except for the sound of her own name. Her attention snapped to David, who became visibly alert, his sharp gaze meeting the others. They all exchanged looks of understanding before David's commanding voice broke the silence. "Chanty, let's go. Alexander Mondragon wants to speak with you." "Only 3 guardians are allowed to accompany us," he declared authoritatively. "Jake, Gabriel, you're with me." Without waiting for a response, David strode forward, his steps echoing with power as Jake and Gabriel followed. Jake's hand remained firmly clasped around Chanty's, his presence a steadying force. They moved toward a door that opened before them, drawing the curious eyes of the room's occupants. Whispers and intrigued stares followed their every step, particularly directed at Don Lorenzo. The unknown woman piqued their curiosity, her identity sparking silent questions. As they entered the next room, Chanty's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened as she took in the awe-inspiring sight, a room with walls made entirely of monitors, offering a 360-degree view of the entire city and its outskirts. The seamless screens captured Velantis in its full splendor, the bustling activity outside the building rendered vividly. The interior's white and gold theme extended to the furniture and decorations, adding an air of elegance and royalty to the space. However, Chanty's gaze was soon drawn to the golden sofa in the center of the room, where a figure sat. Jake's hand clenched hers more tightly, his grip firm and almost possessive. She glanced at him, puzzled by the sudden gesture, but his focus remained fixed on the man seated on the sofa. Chanty, curious, shifted her gaze, and her breath hitched. The man before her bore a striking resemblance to Vasper Mondragon, yet he was different. His crimson eyes stood out sharply, and the commanding aura he exuded was overwhelming. He sat with a casual elegance, his hands resting on the sofa's arms, feet slightly spread, a faint yet stern smile playing on his lips. His penetrating gaze was locked onto Chanty, studying her intently. "Alexander Mondragon. Draped in a regal red and gold suit adorned with the Velantis Noctem emblem, his presence screamed authority and power. His hair, tied neatly in a ponytail, accentuated his youthful yet impossibly handsome features. Chanty couldn't believe her eyes. Despite having seen him in her dreams, the reality of standing before him was a completely different experience. He looked far younger than she had imagined, his appearance defying the years she had assumed him to carry. David and the others slightly bowed their heads in respect, but Jake stood firm, his expression unyielding as he stared at Alexander. Shanta's heart raced, a mix of anxiety and awe coursing through her. She had no idea what awaited her in this encounter, but one thing was certain: facing Alexander Mondragon would change everything. Alexander Mondragon stood tall, his movements fluid and feline, radiating an aura of indomitable power wrapped in an almost ethereal grace. A faint, enigmatic smile curved his lips as his piercing crimson gaze swept over David, Jake, Gabriel, and finally settled on Chanty. Her wide eyes betrayed an unspoken vulnerability, unable to break free from his magnetic presence. "Thank you, David, for accepting my invitation," Alexander intoned, his deep, resonant voice reverberating through the room like distant thunder. Rising to his full height, he exuded an almost hypnotic elegance, each motion precise and commanding. His gaze, unwavering from Chanty, carried an intensity that seemed to reach into her soul, as though unearthing secrets she had yet to uncover. With a subtle gesture, Alexander motioned toward the ornate sofas, an invitation laced with unspoken authority. But David, ever the embodiment of composure and audacity, politely declined with a confident smile. Alexander's response was a knowing smirk, his crimson eyes gleaming like molten rubies, mesmerizing and perilous, as though daring anyone to hold his gaze too long. Chanty remained frozen, her mind racing while her body betrayed her composure. Meanwhile, Jake's sharp eyes darted toward Chanty, scrutinizing her reaction with the precision of a blade, as though deciphering the unspoken. "David," Alexander began, his voice booming with an almost thunderous authority that echoed across the room. "There's no problem. It's fine." His tone darkened, the air seeming to grow heavier. "But I called you here because, before you even entered this building, I was watching you from the outside up until the moment you stepped inside." David's jaw tightened, his steely gaze meeting Alexander's with an intensity that matched the looming figure. As Alexander stepped closer, his movements calm yet unnervingly deliberate, David and Gabriel shifted instantly, positioning themselves protectively in front of Chanty. Jake, without hesitation, tightened his hold around her waist, pulling her closer like a shield. The suddenness of the gesture drew a deep, resonant laugh from Alexander, a sound both chilling and mocking as it echoed through the room. His crimson eyes sparkled with amusement, the edges of his lips curling into a smile that carried a dangerous edge. But as quickly as the laughter came, it vanished. Alexander raised a hand, the movement so slight yet imbued with an undeniable authority. With a flick of his wrist, David and Gabriel were hurled against opposite walls, their bodies slamming into the surface with a force. Pinned by an invisible power, they struggled but remained trapped. Shanta's heart pounded in her chest as Jake's grip tightened protectively, his strength unwavering even under the oppressive force Alexander exuded. Yet, even Jake was not immune. With another subtle gesture, Alexander pulled him away from Chanty as though by an unseen force. Jake's body lurched backward despite his resistance, leaving Chanty exposed. Her cry of alarm rang out, her trembling hands reaching desperately for Jake's. Tears welled in her eyes, her heart thundering as panic set in. The overwhelming power Alexander wielded rendered them utterly helpless. When she finally dared to lift her gaze, she found herself face to face with Alexander. His presence was suffocating, the heat of his proximity and the intoxicating scent of his cologne filling her senses. His warm hand cupped her face, his touch gentle, almost tender, as he wiped away her tears, a sharp contrast to the chaos he had unleashed. "Don Lorenzo," Alexander murmured, his voice smooth yet edged with steel. "I never imagined you would be this beautiful in person. Now, I understand why Vasper went mad over you. I understand." His words carried a weight that pressed against Shanta's chest, her breath hitching as she stared into his crimson eyes. In them, she caught a resemblance to Vasper Mondragon that was both haunting and undeniable. Her mind screamed against the connection, desperate to sever the thread. "No!" Shanta's thoughts cried, frantic and defiant. He is not Vasper. In a flash, the sword of destiny materialized in her hand, its radiant glow tearing through the oppressive tension like a blade of light. The force of its appearance sent Alexander crashing into the far wall with a deafening impact, the room bathed in its brilliant aura. The invisible bindings on David and Gabriel dissolved instantly, and they sprang to their feet. Jake, a blur of motion, was at Chanty's side in an instant, his body taut with readiness as he adopted a defensive stance. David and Gabriel mirrored his focus, their sharp gazes fixed on Alexander, prepared for battle. Alexander, however, rose smoothly from the wreckage, his movements eerily composed, as though the sword's impact was little more than a minor inconvenience. Chanty's breath hitched as she watched him, her mind reeling at the sheer grace and dominance he exuded. A faint, amused smile played on his lips as he returned to his seat on the gilded sofa, his posture relaxed and regal. His crimson eyes, unwavering and calculating, fixed on David and Chanty. "David, relax," Alexander said, his voice calm but carrying a quiet, commanding authority. "We are not enemies. I don't waste my strength on people who are neither my enemies nor have wronged me." His gaze darkened, his tone sharpening like a blade. "I am not like your king, who destroys anyone who dares to stand in his way." Leaning back, Alexander's demeanor remained unshaken, his regal presence filling the room. The air remained thick with tension, every breath heavy as the guardians stood ready, their focus never wavering from the man who had so effortlessly demonstrated his superiority. Alexander's voice was calm, resonant, and deceptively soothing as he spoke. "Don't worry, I'm not that kind of person." His relaxed yet commanding tone echoed through the room, but his words did little to ease the suffocating tension. David stood resolute, his stance unwavering, flanked by Jake and Gabriel, their eyes sharp with vigilance. Chanty, however, felt a surge of courage swelling within her. With the sword of destiny glowing in her grasp, her earlier fear dissipated, replaced by a newfound strength. The weapon's energy coursed through her veins, steadying her resolve. Alexander's intense gaze shifted between Chanty and the sword, scrutinizing both the radiant object and the woman wielding it with keen interest. "Miss Don Lorenzo," Alexander began, his crimson eyes locking onto hers. "How are you? Do you like my city?" His tone carried a veneer of casual politeness, yet beneath it lay a thread of curiosity and hidden intent. Chanty remained silent, her lips pressed into a firm line, refusing to engage. Alexander took a step forward, his movements deliberate, his unblinking gaze fixed on her. "Now that you're finally standing before me," he continued, his voice deepening, "everything has changed." He paused, the air in the room growing heavier with anticipation. "And I want to announce that." Alexander straightened to his full height, his figure commanding and formidable, as if the air itself bowed to his presence. David, Jake, and Gabriel tensed, bracing themselves for whatever was coming. Then, with a gravity that struck like a thunderclap, Alexander declared, "I want Don Lorenzo to become my queen of Velantis Noctem." The words hit like a physical blow. David's posture stiffened, his composure strained as he processed the weight of the declaration. Chanty and Jake were visibly shaken, their eyes wide with shock. Chanty's lips parted in disbelief, her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't tell whether Alexander was serious or playing a cruel, manipulative game. David was the first to recover, his tone sharp and cutting as he addressed Alexander. "Sorry, Your Majesty," he said, his voice laced with defiance. "I must be hearing things." His sharp gaze bore into Alexander's, unyielding, as he sought to unravel the man's true intentions. Alexander's lips curled into a faint smile, his gaze softening ever so slightly as it rested on Chanty. The affection in his eyes was subtle but undeniable. Jake, on the other hand, was trembling with rage, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw tightened, his glare burning into Alexander, while his protective grip on Chanty's waist grew more desperate. Alexander's gaze flicked downward, noting Jake's possessive hold on Chanty. His smile widened, but it carried a dangerous warning. "You heard me correctly, David," Alexander said, his voice steady and firm. "Yes, I want her to be my queen here in Velantis. Tell your king that I am willing to cooperate with your kingdom, depending on the terms, of course, and only if they suit me." Before anyone could react, the atmosphere shifted, crackling with unseen energy. In a blur of motion, Jake teleported behind Alexander, his intent to strike clear as day. But Alexander moved faster. His hand shot out with unnatural speed, gripping Jake by the neck before anyone could intervene. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled Jake across the room, sending him crashing into the reinforced wall. The impact reverberated like thunder, though the wall held firm. Jake slumped to the ground, momentarily stunned. Raising his right hand toward David and Gabriel, Alexander held Jake in place with an invisible telekinetic force. Both David and Gabriel froze, their movements arrested as though caught in an unbreakable grip. Only Chanty remained free, her trembling hands clutching the sword of destiny. Despite the chaos, Chanty's fear melted into determination. Gritting her teeth, she steadied herself and took a bold step forward. Letting out a fierce battle cry, she lunged at Alexander, swinging the sword with precision and force. But Alexander vanished in a split second, his form reappearing in another corner of the room. His crimson eyes gleamed with amusement even as he maintained his hold on the three guardians. Don Lorenzo, Alexander called out, his voice softer now, almost coaxing, as he dodged her relentless strikes with ease. My plans have changed. His tone became smooth, almost hypnotic, dripping with charm. Don't you wish to be queen in my kingdom? To stand by my side? Chanty froze mid-swing, her breath hitching as his words pierced through her resolve like a blade. His voice carried an alluring undertone, his smile disarming yet dangerous. His gaze locked onto hers, unrelenting, as though he were peering into the deepest recesses of her soul. She shook her head fiercely, struggling to rid herself of his magnetic pull. Breathing heavily, Chanty steadied herself, refusing to falter. She couldn't match his speed with her eyes alone. Then she remembered Vasper's training, his lessons on relying on her other senses. Slowly, she closed her eyes, attuning herself to the subtle shifts in the air, the faint sounds of movement, and the rhythm of her surroundings. When she reopened her eyes, they burned with newfound determination. Pointing the sword of destiny at Alexander, she spoke in a clear, commanding voice, "Release them, David and the others. Face me, Alexander, in the desert. There, we will test our strengths against each other." For the first time, Alexander's confident smile faltered. His expression darkened, shifting into something more intrigued, almost predatory. The room held its breath, the air thick with tension, awaiting his answer. Chanty's voice erupted like a storm, her words carrying the weight of unyielding defiance and righteous fury. "Forget your ambition, because I will never be your queen." The air in the chamber trembled with her anger, slicing through the oppressive silence like a blade. Her gaze burned with fire as she confronted Alexander Mondragon, the object of her wrath. Alexander lounged on his throne-like sofa, exuding an aura of eternal dominion. The shadows of millennia seemed to cling to him, wrapping him in a regal confidence that bordered on arrogance. His smile was a chilling enigma, hauntingly sweet, yet devoid of remorse. Crimson eyes, brimming with the weight of ancient secrets, bore into Chanty's without a flicker of doubt. He remained motionless, unshaken, as if the space between them was a mere formality. Her sword gleamed with a light that seemed older than time itself, its aura declaring its purpose. If it pierced his chest, it would end him. And yet, Alexander laughed. The sound was deep, resonant, and strangely hypnotic. It wasn't the laugh of a man mocking his opponent, but something more sinister, a sound that drew the listener in, as if tempting them to surrender. It carried the allure of his bloodline, the same spellbinding quality his son, Vasper Mondragon, wielded. But where Vasper's charm was youthful and intoxicating, Alexander's bore the weight of eons, a predatory elegance that spoke of untold power. "Release them," Chanty demanded, her voice sharp and unrelenting, cutting through his laughter like lightning through a storm. Alexander leaned forward, his crimson gaze sharpening. The smile on his lips widened, his expression one of dark amusement. "Fierce," he murmured, his tone a velvet caress laced with danger. "I like that in a woman. I like you, Don Lorenzo. That fire in your eyes, it makes you irresistible." His words slithered through the air like a serpent, dripping with menace and seduction. But Chanty's resolve did not waver. Her hand trembled on the hilt of her sword, not from fear but from the sheer intensity of the confrontation. She knew the truth: Alexander would never release David or her companions. This was all a game to him, a twisted dance of dominance. Chanty stepped back cautiously, her movements calculated as she reached for Jake. She gripped his hand tightly, her eyes never leaving Alexander. She couldn't afford even a moment's lapse. If she faltered, Alexander might close the distance. And if he touched her, she knew she would be lost. Her heart sank the moment her fingers wrapped around Jake's hand. His skin was deathly cold, his body unnaturally rigid as though turned to stone. No matter how hard she pulled, Jake didn't move, his lifeless form refusing to yield. Alexander watched her struggle, his amusement deepening. His smile widened, his crimson eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. "Don Lorenzo," he began, his voice smooth as silk, yet underpinned with an unrelenting authority. "I know everything about you, and about Jake Valerian." His words were a knife, sharp and precise. "Nothing escapes me. Not the madness my son, Vasper, harbors for you. Not your relentless pursuit of vengeance. I have watched you, waited for the moment fate would bring you to me." He paused, his tone darkening, the air around him growing heavier. "I never anticipated it would be under such circumstances. My treacherous son's rebellion has caused chaos, but it has delivered one blessing, you. And to my delight, I see you remain untouched. A virgin." Chanty froze, revulsion flashing across her face as his words pierced her. Alexander's grin turned wolfish, his voice dipping into a chilling resonance. "Do you know what that means, Chanty? When I drink your blood, I will finally achieve what has eluded me for millennia. Immortality." His laughter filled the room, a rich, malevolent symphony that reverberated in her very bones. Her rage surged anew, her grip on Jake's hand tightening as her thoughts turned to her parents, their faces flashing in her mind, igniting a fire in her heart. "You're the reason my parents are dead," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her fury and grief. "You'll pay for what you've done to my family." For the briefest moment, Alexander's expression shifted. The predatory smile faded, and something inscrutable flickered in his eyes. "And who told you I was the one responsible for their deaths?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly calm, almost gentle. The softness in his tone was more jarring than any threat. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Chanty, but I don't meddle with mortals, least of all those who pose no threat to me." His words carried an eerie conviction. "Ask your king," Alexander continued, his tone laden with implication. "From what I know, it benefited them far more for your mother to disappear, didn't it?" Chanty's mind reeled, torn between disbelief and the unsettling logic in his words. But she pushed the thought aside, unwilling to trust anything that came from him. Her glare locked on Alexander, her eyes blazing with challenge and defiance. "Enough of your lies, Alexander," she spat, stepping closer with her sword raised high. "Release David and face me. Just the two of us, in the desert. No guardians. No tricks." Alexander's smile returned, slow and calculating, his crimson eyes gleaming with wicked intent. "Very well," he said, his voice as smooth as velvet. "If that is your wish, I'll grant it. But not outside Velantis. My power is bound to this realm, and I cannot leave it. However, there is a desert within my kingdom where we can settle this matter." He paused, his gaze piercing through her like a dagger. "But I have conditions. If you fail to defeat me within 9 hours, you will agree to become my queen. If you win, you and your friends will walk free. Those are my terms." Chanty's glare hardened, her fury undiminished. "You have no right to set conditions, Alexander Mondragon," she spat, her voice echoing with righteous anger. "I'm here to bring justice, for my parents, for everyone you've harmed." Alexander's laughter came softer this time, but it carried an eerie chill that seemed to seep into the air around them. "Then perhaps I should end their lives now," he replied coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. Before Chanty could react, Alexander summoned a bow and arrow from thin air, the weapon appearing in his hands as if by magic. Chanty's breath hitched as she recognized it immediately. It was the very same bow and arrow she had seen in the prophecy, the weapon Alexander used to kill Jake in the desert. Her heart raced, but she didn't falter. The air around them crackled with raw energy as Alexander drew the string back, aiming the arrow directly at Jake. Shanta's eyes widened in panic, her body moving on instinct. With a desperate cry, she thrust her hand forward as though sheer willpower could halt the inevitable. In an instant, her body surged with power. Her eyes blazed with light as she lunged forward, her movements fueled by desperation and resolve. The arrow flew, but before it could reach its target, Chanty caught it mid-flight. The weapon dissolved into pure light in her grasp, its energy surging into her body. The sword of destiny glowed brighter than ever, its power responding to her unwavering will. Alexander's smile didn't falter. In fact, it deepened with twisted amusement as he observed her protectiveness over Jake. He leaned back slightly, as if watching a captivating performance. Shanta's voice cracked with raw emotion as she cried out, "No. Please, don't." Without hesitation, she threw herself over Jake's body, shielding him with her own. Tears streamed down her face, her desperation an uncontainable storm. Alexander lowered his hand, the bow and arrow vanishing as if they had never existed. But the mocking, sarcastic smile on his lips remained, cutting deeper than any blade. His crimson gaze boring to her, sharp and taunting, as though daring her to strike. "I'll agree to your terms," Shanta said at last, her voice trembling but filled with steely resolve. "Release David." With a flick of his wrist, Alexander summoned the elven staff, and with a commanding gesture, David and the others were freed. Yet their movements were sluggish, their bodies stiff as if awakening from an unnaturally deep slumber. Shanta's heart pounded as she watched them struggle toward the door, each step an agonizing effort. Relief was fleeting, however, as Alexander's voice sliced through the moment like a blade. "Look at them," he said, motioning toward a wall monitor. Chanty turned, her breath catching in her throat. On the screen, she saw David and the others outside, pounding desperately against the sealed door. Each of Jake's attempts to teleport back was thwarted by an invisible force, his efforts growing weaker with every failure. Alexander's laughter echoed through the chamber once more, unrestrained and dripping with malice. "They should stop," he mused, his voice laced with mockery. "If they keep damaging my door, Chanty, you'll be the one paying for their recklessness." Her grip on the sword of destiny tightened, the weapon pulsing in response to her fury. Shanta's gaze locked with Alexander's, her eyes ablaze with defiance. A voice, soft but unrelenting, whispered in her mind, "I'm hungry." Shanta's breath hitched, the sword's words resonating within her. Alexander's smile widened, as though he too had heard the weapon's plea. "I heard the sword, Don Lorenzo," Alexander said, his voice a mix of amusement and menace. "It's thirsty for my blood. It craves my end. And yes, the prophecy claims it will be the instrument of my death. But if I strike first—" He leaned closer, his crimson eyes glowing with dangerous intent. "Another 1,000 years of life will be mine." His voice dropped to a near whisper, laced with dark amusement. "Do you know how weary I've grown of this existence? And yet, all of that changed the moment I saw you outside that building. Don't worry, though, I'll leave you enough blood to survive. You'll live, as my queen." Alexander's words twisted like a blade in her mind, but she refused to falter. Raising the sword of destiny, she met his taunting gaze with unshakable determination. "The prophecy ends with you, Alexander," she declared, her voice fierce and resolute. "I will be the one to end your reign." Their gazes locked, the air between them thick with the weight of destiny. Shanta's heart thundered in her chest, but her grip on the sword remained steady. Alexander's expression was one of pure amusement, as though he relished the coming storm. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the prelude to a battle that would decide the fate of kingdoms. The moment stretched into eternity as their fates entwined, the battle about to begin. And then, in a flash, Alexander was gone. Panic surged through Shanta like a storm tearing through her veins. Her breathing quickened as she spun around, her eyes darting frantically in every direction. The room felt oppressive, the air heavy, as though his presence lingered even in his absence. She could feel him, his energy coiling around her, unseen but suffocating, like an invisible chain binding her to his will. She turned again, her movements wild and desperate, and then froze. Alexander reappeared, but not where she expected. He stood on the opposite side of the room, his dark, piercing eyes locked onto hers with a predatory precision that sent a chill racing down her spine. His grin was slow, deliberate, and menacing, like a predator savoring the moment before the hunt. Before Chanty could react, Alexander closed the distance between them with inhuman speed. He moved faster than thought, faster than the blink of an eye. His hands shot out, seizing both of her wrists in a grip that was cold and unyielding, like steel forged in the fires of some ancient, otherworldly furnace. "Alexander!" Chanty gasped, her voice trembling as she struggled to break free. But Alexander's strength was overwhelming. Effortlessly, he lifted her arms above her head, pinning her wrists as if they were bound by iron chains. Chanty's breath hitched, panic and frustration surging as she realized she couldn't break his hold. And then, with another flash of teleportation, Chanty felt herself being pulled through space. The world around her blurred, twisting into an unrecognizable haze. When her vision cleared, she realized they were on the sofa. Her body was pinned beneath Alexander's. The realization struck her like lightning. His weight pressed down on her, not crushing, but firm enough to immobilize her. His knees pinned her legs, and his chest hovered dangerously close to hers. The space around them seemed to collapse, narrowing until there was nothing but the two of them. Their faces were mere inches apart, and every nerve in Chanty's body screamed with tension. Her mouth fell open in shock, her lips trembling as her mind raced to process what had just happened. She could feel Alexander's breath brushing against her skin, warm and steady, mingling with the intoxicating scent of his perfume, a scent that wrapped around her senses like a fog she desperately wanted to escape. Alexander's eyes burned like molten rubies, alive with a fire that both captivated and terrified her. His gaze bore into hers, unyielding and intense, as though he were peering into the depths of her soul. Slowly, he leaned in closer, his smile a blend of playfulness and menace that sent shivers racing down her spine. "Now I understand," he murmured, his voice a low, seductive rumble that felt like a caress. "Now I know why my son has gone mad for you, Don Lorenzo." His crimson eyes roamed her face, tracing every feature, lingering on her lips. His gaze was unnervingly intimate, as though he was memorizing every detail. Then, with a hint of restraint, he bit his lower lip, a gesture of frustration and desire. "You smell so good," he whispered, his voice dropping even lower, a murmur meant only for her ears. Chanty's heart thundered in her chest, her defiance burning brighter against the oppressive fear. Her fiery eyes locked onto his, refusing to yield even an inch. In Alexander's face, she saw an unsettling resemblance to Vasper Mondragon, so uncanny they could be twins, if not for the difference in their eyes. But now, staring at Alexander, Chanty realized she was seeing a true vampire for the first time. Unlike the cold, lifeless beings portrayed in movies, Alexander's skin was warm, almost human. Chanty struggled against him, pouring all her strength into breaking free, but her body wouldn't respond. "Get off me, Alexander," she spat, her voice trembling with rage and resolve. "Let me go. You're a coward. You think using your strength against a woman proves anything? Fight me in the desert with your sword. Face me in the open, where no one else can get hurt." Her words were sharp, each syllable dripping with venom, but Alexander remained unmoved. Instead, he closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, as though savoring her presence. "I love the smell of your breath," he murmured softly, his voice laced with dark amusement. Chanty's panic deepened, her breaths coming in short, frantic gasps. She clenched her fists and cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. "Vasper! Help me! Please!" Alexander's laughter rang out, rich and mocking, cutting through her plea like a blade. He threw his head back, his amusement unrestrained, as though her call for Vasper was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Chanty's fury ignited. She tried to push him off with every ounce of strength she had, but Alexander didn't budge. His frame was immovable, his presence overwhelming, like trying to shift a mountain. Her wrists ached from his grip, her arms pinned so tightly above her head that she could barely move. The burning in her muscles mirrored the fiery determination in her eyes. Alexander's gaze softened slightly, but the crimson glow of his eyes remained sharp and hypnotic. His smile widened as he leaned even closer, his breath ghosting over her lips. "Shouldn't I be the one afraid of you?" Alexander mused, his voice teasing, his tone laced with dark humor. "You're the one destined to end my life with a single mistake. One wrong move, and my immortality is lost forever." His words dripped with mockery, but there was an underlying vulnerability, a fleeting glimpse of something deeper beneath the charm. Chanty gritted her teeth, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're despicable," she hissed. "I won't fall for your games, Alexander Mondragon. You think you can scare me into submission? Think again." Alexander's smile didn't waver. If anything, her defiance only seemed to fuel his amusement. He leaned in until the space between them was nearly non-existent, his crimson eyes glowing with an intensity that threatened to consume her. "You should stop struggling, Chanty," he said softly, his tone like silk against her ears. "Your fire only makes you more tempting." Chanty glared at him, her voice trembling with determination. "I'll never stop fighting you, Alexander. Never." Alexander's laughter returned, low and unsettling, like a predator toying with its prey. And for a fleeting, horrifying moment, Chanty felt as though he was playing with her very soul. Alexander's eyes softened, gazing deeply into Chanty's, as if he could see into her very soul. The quiet intensity in his expression was unsettling, a stark contrast to the raw power that seemed to radiate from him. "So, this is how my son loves? He truly captured your heart, Don Lorenzo," Alexander murmured, his sly smile curving upward. His voice was calm, but it carried a sharp undertone, probing. "Will you become just another woman he plays with and discards? Like Zalora?" Chanty froze. His words stabbed at her heart, each syllable tightening the weight in her chest. She struggled to mask the pain his words caused, but Alexander caught it all. His knowing smirk deepened, reading her like an open book. "I must admit," Alexander continued, his tone laced with both curiosity and amusement, "I underestimated your influence. I even tried to erase his memories of you, yet it failed." His crimson eyes flickered toward her lips, his voice lowering. "Your essence is far too potent." The deliberate intensity of his words sent a shiver through Chanty, her breathing quickening as she fought to steady herself. "Vasper, help me," she screamed, her eyes darting toward the monitor on the wall, a lifeline to the world outside this torment. Alexander's laughter rang out, dark and rich, as his gaze followed hers. He seemed utterly amused by her desperation, as if her fear was a thrilling game. Beyond the sealed door, the 7 guardians stood with grim faces, tension radiating from them. Jake pounded on the barrier with all his might, his frustration growing as the soundproof walls absorbed every blow. "Open!" Jake roared, his fist slamming against the door. Beside him, Jacob unleashed blue flames, their light flashing against the unyielding surface. But it was useless. Inside, Alexander's mocking laughter grew louder. His eyes darkened as they roamed to Chanty's neck. His lips twitched, desire threatening to consume him, but he restrained himself with visible effort. "Not yet," he murmured, almost to himself. "It's not time." He threw his head back, laughing harder, his voice carrying a dangerous blend of mockery and delight. "And now my son is a hero?" His tone dripped with scorn. "After all his foolishness, here and in the outer world, you've turned him into some kind of savior?" Chanty clenched her fists, her face flushed with fury. Tears pricked her eyes as her gaze darted to the monitor, where Jake's frustration mirrored her helplessness. And then, in an instant, Vasper Mondragon appeared. His arrival was silent but powerful, the very air seeming to tremble as his towering form materialized. His burning eyes burned with intensity as they locked onto the scene before him. Chanty's heart leaped at the sight of him, her emotions a whirlwind of relief and disbelief. Vasper's body was covered in blood and grime, his bare chest heaving from exertion. His leather pants were torn, clinging to him in shreds, yet his presence exuded strength and raw magnetism. Alexander turned, his expression faltering for a split second as he registered Vasper's sudden appearance. A deadly smile tugged at his lips, his irritation at being interrupted mingling with amusement. Without a word, Vasper lunged. His hands clamped onto Alexander's shoulders, gripping with inhuman strength. With a feral growl, Vasper hurled his father across the room as if he weighed nothing. Alexander crashed into the wall, the impact shaking Chanty's body in fear. Slowly, he rose, his expression deadly yet entertained. His lips curved into a dangerous smile, his jaw tightening as he watched his son with a mix of irritation and pride. Vasper didn't waste a moment. He turned to Chanty, sweeping her into his arms with protective urgency. His embrace was firm, his bare skin warm and solid beneath her trembling hands. Chanty clung to him, her fingers brushing against his blood-streaked chest, feeling the strength of his heartbeat beneath her touch. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of emotions passing between them. Vasper's gaze was intense, filled with worry and unspoken love, while Chanty's was wide with awe and confusion. Her arms instinctively gripped his neck, holding on to him as if he were her anchor. She barely noticed, her focus entirely on Vasper. Her other hand slid down to rest against his chest, feeling the heat of his skin, the ripple of his muscles beneath her touch. Around them, time seemed to freeze. The world narrowed to just the two of them, their breaths mingling, their hearts pounding in unison. Vasper's jaw clenched, his protective instincts roaring to life as his gaze flicked toward Alexander. Alexander, still leaning casually against the wall, watched them with sharp crimson eyes, his expression deadly serious. His presence loomed like a dark cloud, but in that moment, Chanty felt safe in Vasper's arms. Whatever storm lay ahead, they would face it together. Before either of them could react, Alexander reappeared in a blur of motion that defied logic. In an instant, he had snatched Chanty from Vasper's arms, laughing triumphantly as he did so. Vasper and Chanty's eyes widened in shock at the speed of Alexander's movement. Faster than a blink, Chanty was ripped away from Vasper's embrace, leaving him momentarily stunned. Too slow, Vasper, Alexander taunted, his grin mocking and wide. He held Chanty tightly, her body pressed against his as his piercing gaze challenged his son. Vasper's face darkened, his fury barely contained as his fists clenched. His glare was sharp enough to cut through the tension that now hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Caught in Alexander's grasp, Chanty struggled with all her might. Her body tensed, her heart pounding wildly. Desperation ignited something deep within her, and with sheer determination, she summoned the sword of destiny once more. The blade materialized in her hand, and in that instant, a surge of power erupted from her body like a shockwave. The force sent Alexander and Vasper flying in opposite directions, slamming them into the walls of the room. Chanty herself was thrown to the ground, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. The room fell silent for a beat, save for the heavy breaths of its occupants. Both Alexander and Vasper quickly recovered, alert and battle-ready, though their eyes betrayed a moment of disbelief. Chanty pushed herself up, gasping for air. As she rose, a strange transformation began to take hold. Her body radiated with an otherworldly energy, her once vivid expression hardening into a cold, emotionless mask. Her eyes glowed an intense, ethereal blue, radiating power that was almost terrifying. Vasper stood tall, his powerful form tense and ready for anything. His gaze locked onto Chanty, a mixture of shock and awe flickering across his face. Across the room, Alexander straightened himself, his expression shifting from amusement to sharp focus. But in Alexander's eyes, there was also excitement, a twisted kind of anticipation. His lips curved into a subtle, sinister smile as he observed Chanty's transformation. His thoughts raced with exhilaration as he realized what was unfolding before him. This was the battle he had been waiting for. The prophecies spoke of the wielder of the sword of destiny, someone who could end his reign, his life. Yet instead of fear, Alexander was filled with a sense of purpose. He longed to test the limits of his power against this prophecy, to see if it could truly challenge him. Vasper, meanwhile, glanced at his father, his lips curling into a sarcastic smile. "This is what you wanted, right? Face her, then. Let her satisfy your twisted desire for a challenge." His voice was sharp, dripping with contempt. For as long as Vasper could remember, Alexander was no father to him. The man had been the source of his mother's suffering, her life filled with heartbreak because of her love for him. Vasper had carried that pain, that memory, and it had solidified his hatred for Alexander. Alexander chuckled, his amusement returning as he gazed at his son. Vasper, I'm sorry, but she's mine. I'll take her from you, and she will become my queen. She will reign over Velantis by my side. The words hit Vasper like thunder, hardening his expression into one of pure rage. His jaw clenched, his teeth grinding as his entire body trembled with anger. His gaze burned with an intensity that spoke of his unrelenting defiance. Alexander smirked at his son's reaction, his amusement only deepening. His crimson eyes sparkled with both malice and delight as he met Vasper's glare head-on. The room was thick with animosity, the air crackling with the unspoken clash of their wills. And in the center of it all stood Chanty. Her glowing eyes flicked between the two of them, her presence commanding and unyielding. She was no longer the woman they had fought over, she had become something far greater, something more powerful. The two men, father and son, stood like mirror images, both radiating immense power, yet utterly different in their principles, their goals, and their ways of life. Now, they found themselves drawn into a fateful confrontation over the same woman. For Vasper, Chanty was the light that pulled him out of darkness, the one thing he wanted to protect and cherish. Yet fate seemed to conspire against him, throwing obstacle after obstacle in his path. For Alexander, she was not about love but conquest, power to be wielded, a queen to crown. His hunger for domination and defiance of the prophecy burned hotter than ever. Vasper's body shook with fury as he stared down his father, but then his eyes flicked briefly to the monitor on the wall, where the 7 guardians outside pounded on the sealed door, desperate to enter. He let out a dark laugh, knowing their efforts were futile. The black diamond barrier wouldn't yield to their strength. Turning back to Alexander, Vasper's gaze hardened further as it shifted to Chanty. He knew shadow of the sword now dominated her being, and this wasn't a fight he's been waiting for, against Alexander Mondragon. Vasper's sharp eyes locked onto the sword of destiny, now wielded by Chanty's transformed body. The sword flickered ominously, and its presence made the air around her crackle with danger. Her gaze, once filled with emotion, now resembled a predator's hunger as she stared directly at Alexander Mondragon. Chanty's lips curved into a faint, chilling smile, but her eyes held no warmth. They were cold, deadly, and unyielding. It was as if she had forgotten Vasper entirely, her focus singularly trained on Alexander. Vasper stood ready, muscles tense and senses on high alert, his instincts screaming at him to intervene. Yet, a part of him felt an unexpected wave of relief. Chanty could now defend herself. He watched in awe as her ethereal form seemed to float, her hair drifting like it was submerged in water, every strand glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Her beauty, already striking, now radiated an almost divine aura. Without warning, Chanty lunged at Alexander with blistering speed, the sword of destiny igniting into a blaze of red energy that pulsed with a hunger of its own. Its glow brightened, a clear signal of its insatiable thirst for power. Alexander barely reacted in time. His form flickered, teleporting away just as the blade sliced through the air where he had been standing. Vasper could do nothing but watch as the clash unfolded before him, the movements so fast they blurred like lightning. Chanty pressed forward relentlessly, each strike of her sword sparking with fiery brilliance. Alexander's expression grew serious as he dodged strike after strike, his teleportation the only thing keeping him ahead of her relentless attacks. The sheer ferocity in Chanty's blows forced him on the defensive, his body twisting and vanishing from one side of the room to the other. Vasper's jaw tightened. He could see it, the sword's energy growing brighter, more vivid, its crimson hue deepening. The weapon wasn't just powerful, it was alive. It thrived on the fight, on the chaos, and it hungered for Alexander blood. In a sudden blur of movement, Alexander reappeared behind Chanty. Before she could react, he wrapped his arms around her in a vice-like grip, pinning her arms to her sides. "You've grown strong, my future queen," Alexander murmured, his voice low but carrying an edge of amusement. Before anyone could act, the two vanished. "Chanty!" Vasper's voice thundered as he snapped into motion. Without another word he teleported out of the room instantly, reappearing outside where the 7 guardians stood waiting. Their eyes widened as Vasper materialized before them, his appearance disheveled and bloodied, his chest heaving with exertion. "They're gone," Vasper barked, his voice filled with urgency. He turned to David, who looked equally shocked at Vasper's sudden arrival. Jake clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he glared at Vasper. Behind them, the other entities watched in silence, their eyes filled with curiosity and concern. "Jake, use your power to locate them. Make yourself useful," Vasper commanded, his voice sharp and filled with authority. He glanced back at David. "Alexander can't leave Velantis, but he has countless hidden places, some even I don't know about." David nodded, his expression grave, but before he could respond, Vasper disappeared again, teleporting away without warning. Jake's face darkened, frustration and worry etched across his features. He turned to David, his voice trembling with urgency. "David, do whatever it takes. I'll find Chanty myself." Without waiting for a response, Jake vanished as well, his determination evident. The remaining guardians wasted no time. One by one, they exited the building and boarded their flying vehicles. The sleek crafts soared into the skies, spreading out across Velantis Noctem, their mission clear: locate Chanty and Alexander. The city glimmered beneath them, its dark, sprawling expanse illuminated. The guardians scoured every corner of the vast metropolis, yet no matter how thorough their search, there was no trace of Alexander or Chanty. "They're cloaked," David muttered under his breath, frustration evident in his tone. "Alexander's using some kind of invisible shielding. He's hiding her somewhere we can't detect." Hours passed as the guardians zigzagged through the city, their desperation growing with every passing minute. Jacob, especially, was on edge. His concern for Chanty was written all over his face, his brows furrowed deeply as he piloted the vehicle through the bustling airways of Velantis Noctem. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David made a decision. "Enough. We need better equipment," he said through their shared comms. "Return to the tent. We need to gather every advanced device we have to track them, thermal heat sensors, energy scanners, whatever it takes." The guardians reluctantly turned back, their vehicles speeding toward their base. Inside the tent, they began assembling their tools, their expressions grim and focused. "We can't waste more time," Jacob said, urgency thick in his voice. He loaded diamond bullets into his specially crafted gun, the glint of determination in his eyes. David nodded, issuing orders swiftly. "Justin, Marco, you take the south. Gabriel and Lewis, head north. I'll cover the west, and Jacob, you take the east." Everyone moved with purpose, grabbing weapons and gear designed to combat supernatural beings like Alexander. Though their powers were formidable, they knew backup was essential. Alexander was far stronger than any of them. Without another word, they scattered, each boarding their chosen vehicles. From the tent, the crafts launched one by one, their sleek forms vanishing into the air as they entered Velantis Noctem. The guardians flew tirelessly, sweeping every sector of the city. Their thermal locators and advanced scanners worked in overdrive, seeking even the faintest trace of Alexander's or Chanty's energy. Behind them, Velantis security vehicles followed closely, 3 crafts shadowing their every move, monitoring their search. Tension hung in the air as the minutes dragged on, their frustration mounting. They knew Alexander was out there, hidden in some impenetrable fortress or cloaked by his powers. And while they searched, one thought loomed in all their minds: Chanty was alone with him. Meanwhile, Chanty and Alexander were locked in an unrelenting battle in the heart of the desert. At first, Alexander found amusement in clashing swords with Chanty, wielding his crystal sword with skill and agility. However, Chanty showed no signs of exhaustion, relentlessly matching his every move. No matter how many times Alexander teleported to evade her attacks, she followed as if she could sense his every movement. Their battle was a blur, like flashes of lightning, each strike and parry executed at breakneck speed. Chanty's sword slashed through the air, and Alexander struggled to deflect her blows. Then, in a desperate move, Alexander put all his strength into a powerful strike, blocking Chanty's sword while simultaneously pushing her away with incredible force. He needed even a brief moment to recover, as a deep, aching pain had begun spreading through his body. Chanty was hurled backward, but she moved like a skilled ninja, landing gracefully on the sand without even disturbing the grains beneath her feet. Her sword plunged into the ground, standing upright as her feet touched the sand. Her warrior's stance, firm and unwavering, was a testament to her mastery of sword fighting. Yet Alexander was acutely aware he was not truly fighting Chanty, but rather the shadow of the sword of destiny, which had taken over her body to challenge him. Their gazes locked, both filled with a deadly seriousness. But despite the intensity of the moment, a faint smirk played on Alexander's lips as he looked into Chanty's eyes. Pain throbbed through his body, his abdomen, his leg, and his shoulder bore deep wounds, each inflicted by the serrated blade of the sword of destiny. The crimson stains on his clothes deepened as his blood seeped from the gashes. He touched his stomach, feeling the wetness of his own blood, though he didn't need to look to confirm it. A bitter laugh escaped him. How many centuries had passed since he last saw his own blood? He wanted to look at his hand, to see the proof of his wounds, but he dared not. Chanty could strike at any moment, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The worst part was that his ability to heal himself had weakened. His power was dwindling, and it would take time before it returned enough for him to mend his wounds. Then, Chanty's eyes flared with excitement, like a predator that had just caught the scent of fresh prey. She saw the blood soaking through Alexander's shirt, trickling down his abdomen, shoulder, and leg. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her movements deliberate, predatory. Her eyes, once human, now gleamed with a feral hunger. Alexander followed suit, standing as well, though the pain in his wounds burrowed deep into his bones. He knew that the sword of destiny carried a venomous curse, just like his own crystal sword. The sword in Chanty's hands pulsed with an eerie glow, its brilliance undiminished even under the scorching desert sun. Its radiance was almost blinding. And with its glow, the pain in Alexander's body intensified, as if the sword itself was feeding off his suffering. He let out a sharp breath but remained standing, his stance strong, exuding an air of power and resilience. His grip on his crystal sword tightened as he smiled, staring at the most breathtaking woman he had ever seen, a mortal, yet fierce beyond compare. Despite everything, excitement stirred within him. The woman before him, the warrior who fought him with such unrelenting ferocity, would one day be his queen. He was certain of it. But first, he needed to obtain what he sought, immortality. He needed to taste her blood, and he would be the one to reclaim the sword of destiny from her grasp, by claiming her virginity. The mere thought thrilled Alexander Mondragon. Once, he had longed for death, hoping for a worthy opponent to finally end his existence in a battle worth remembering. But now, he had found the will to live, to fight for another 1,000 years. Lost in his thoughts, Alexander was caught off guard when Chanty lunged at him with blinding speed. He barely managed to block each of her strikes. Though he used his teleportation, she still managed to keep up with him, following him wherever he went. As their battle dragged on, the desert winds howled around them, kicking up a storm of dust that swirled violently with their every movement. The longer they fought, the more Chanty's eyes changed color, shifting unpredictably. Was this what they called the 6 shadows of the sword of destiny? Alexander let out deep, guttural groans as he struggled against each of Chanty's relentless strikes. Their swords clashed with a thunderous roar, echoing through the merciless desert. Yet, unlike him, Chanty made no sound, not a single grunt, not even a breath of exertion. The pain in Alexander's wounds grew unbearable, his body weakening with every passing second. But Chanty's attacks never ceased. The sound of their swords colliding was like a raging storm, each impact releasing a surge of energy so powerful that even Alexander could barely withstand it. He felt it then, true danger. His life was truly at risk. Not even for a second could he find an opening to strike back. He needed her blood, only then could he regain his strength and agility. His throat burned with thirst, his entire body screaming for sustenance. Yet, Chanty showed no signs of fatigue. She was relentless. Then, in one swift move, Chanty's blade found its mark, piercing deep into Alexander's left side. Agony tore through him. Their battle came to a sudden halt. Chanty's grip on the sword remained firm, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, now glowing red, were filled with a chilling satisfaction. Alexander clutched his wounded side, trying to grasp the sword that impaled him, but his fingers met nothing but air. It was as if the blade had no physical form, like a phantom that could cut but could never be held. Alexander staggered back, taking several steps in retreat, but Chanty followed, still gripping the sword that was buried deep in his side. The sword of destiny was drinking his blood, its blade growing longer and glowing even brighter with every drop it consumed. At the same time, Alexander weakened further. His strength, his very life force, was being drained into the sword. Only the crystal sword had the power to touch the sword of destiny. Their eyes met. Alexander and Chanty locked in a silent battle of will. Both of them were unyielding, their gazes fierce and unwavering. But in Chanty's eyes, there was something more: triumph. A victorious glint burned in her stare. Then, in a sudden flicker of movement, Alexander saw her preparing to strike again. Reacting instantly, he raised his crystal sword and swung it with all his strength, striking the sword of destiny to knock it away from his side while simultaneously leaping backward. A fierce, guttural cry tore from his throat as he executed the move. But the pain, the pain ripped through him like fire. The wound left by the sword of destiny seared deeper into his flesh, the venom coursing through his veins like molten poison. His skin tore further from the movement, and agony dominated every fiber of his being. There was nothing else, only pain. The venom did not merely wound him. It attacked him. Overwhelmed by the torment, Alexander collapsed to his knees in the sand. His crystal sword slipped from his grasp, falling to the ground with a muted thud. His hands dug into the earth for support, trembling from the sheer agony that racked his body. And then, he saw it, the dark, crimson pool forming beneath him, his own blood seeping into the desert floor. His fingers pressed instinctively against his wounded side, where the sword of destiny had impaled him. It was in that moment that fear took hold of him. Fear of death. Fear of disappearing from this world. He had thought he was ready to die, that he could welcome death at any moment. But now, he realized, he wasn't. He wasn't ready to leave this world. He wasn't ready to lose everything. He wasn't ready to abandon Velantis Noctem. He wasn't ready to give up his rule, his influence over both the inner world and the outer world. His breathing grew rapid, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps as he looked up at Chanty. She was smiling. Grinning. Triumph gleamed in her expression as she advanced toward him. And then he knew. She was preparing her final strike. She would finish him. Alexander clenched his jaw, summoning every last ounce of his willpower. He needed to teleport, needed to escape. But his body was betraying him. He gritted his teeth, biting down hard on his lower lip until he tasted blood, trying to force his muscles to move, to obey him. The venom from the sword of destiny resisted him, attacking his very core, gnawing at his life. Chanty moved. Like a tiger pouncing on its prey, she lunged toward Alexander, her sword poised to deliver the final blow. But just as she struck, he vanished. She landed on the ground, her blade slicing through empty air. Alexander Mondragon was gone. All that remained was the blood-stained sand where he had once knelt and the dust that had risen from Chanty's landing. And then, suddenly, the sword of destiny disappeared from Chanty's grasp. The moment Alexander's presence vanished from the battlefield, the sword ceased to exist in her hands. Chanty gasped. Her knees hit the sand, her entire body trembling. And then she realized, she was back. The shadows of the sword no longer controlled her. Her breath came in sharp, ragged pants. Exhaustion crashed over her like a tidal wave, draining the last remnants of her strength. Her arms ached. Her body burned. Even her legs felt like they could barely support her weight. She stared at the ground, at the blood that had soaked the desert sand. It felt like a dream. A nightmare. But she knew it had been real. She had lived through every moment of it. And now that she was fully herself again, the sheer weight of fatigue and thirst hit her all at once. She turned her head, scanning her surroundings. Sand. Everywhere, nothing but an endless desert. How was she supposed to get back? Where was she supposed to go? She had no idea where she was. She had been brought here by Alexander's teleportation, and now, with him gone, she was stranded in this desolate wasteland. Would Alexander return to fight her again? Would he come back at all? She had too many questions, but no certainty in any of them. If she didn't die in battle, perhaps thirst would be the one to kill her instead. Her voice rang out into the emptiness. Vasper, I'm here. Find me. But there was no response. Nothing but the vast, silent desert stretching endlessly around her. Her eyes dropped to the bloodstains on the ground, the last remnants of Alexander Mondragon. She followed the trail with her gaze, her breath hitching at the sight. There was so much blood. Too much. There was no doubt about it, Alexander's wounds were deep. Lethal, even. And yet, he had escaped. Coward. Chanty screamed into the wind. Alexander Mondragon. Face me. You're a coward. Let's finish this fight, don't hide from me. Show yourself. She shouted. She was certain Alexander had a power similar to Vasper, a power that allowed them to heal themselves. Chanty fell to her knees, tears spilling down her face. Her throat was unbearably dry, she needed water. Desperate, she summoned the Sword of Destiny, and in an instant it materialized in her right hand. Please help me. I'm so thirsty, she whispered to the sword. At once, the blade surged with power, growing even longer, its energy intensifying. The blue light in its center burned brighter, pulsing with life. There was no trace of blood on the sword, proof that it had completely absorbed the life force of its enemies. And then, a vision. Chanty saw it. A small tree stood in the distance, its roots cradling a spring of water. The pool shimmered beside a stone, a tiny oasis amidst the endless desert. A laugh bubbled from her lips. She leapt to her feet, pressing a grateful kiss to the blade of her sword. It had shown her the water. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the Sword of Destiny vanished from her grasp. Without hesitation, Chanty ran. The tree was far, but she didn't care. She sprinted toward it with everything she had. It was the only thing standing in the vast, empty desert, a beacon of hope. The dust swallowed her footsteps, her combat boots sinking into the shifting sand. But she didn't stop. She reached a rocky path, leaving the endless dunes behind. She was close now. Closer. And then, finally, she saw it. The water. A small, crystal-clear pond beneath the tree. The sight of it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Thank you, she whispered again and again, her voice trembling with gratitude as she approached. Without a second thought, she dropped to her knees, scooping the water into her cupped hands. She drank, letting the cool liquid soothe her burning throat. Relief. Pure, blissful relief. A deep, satisfied sigh escaped her lips as she drank her fill. Finally, when her thirst was quenched, she leaned back against the tree, letting her gaze wander across the landscape. Had Alexander abandoned her here on purpose? Was this part of his plan? Had he left her to survive the 9 hours, ensuring she couldn't defeat him? Forcing her into a fate she never wanted? To become queen? Chanty scoffed, shaking her head. And who said I'd keep my word, Alexander? She muttered bitterly. Stupid. I must be the stupidest person alive if I actually go along with your plan. She closed her eyes, exhaustion creeping in, but the hunger gnawing at her stomach faded. Vasper. Her mind drifted to him. And the guardians. They had to be searching for her. If they were traveling by flying vehicle, perhaps they could find her. An idea struck her. She could leave a sign. Standing up, she walked toward a large, flat stone. Slowly, she pulled off her wedding ring. She placed it on the rock, watching as the sunlight caught the band, reflecting its glow. It shone brightly, a beacon that could be seen from above. Her eyes lingered on the ring. Blue. Just like the color of her marriage to Jake. But their marriage. It was nothing like the beauty of this ring. Chanty felt her chest tighten. Memories of Jake flooded her mind, each one a fresh wound she had never healed from. Jake, she whispered. I'm so sorry. She closed her eyes, breathing through the pain. I want you to move on. To find happiness without me. To love someone who deserves you, not someone as broken as I am. Her words were meant for no one but herself. With a heavy heart, she stepped away from the stone and returned to the base of the tree. She sat down once more, resting her back against its trunk, her eyes fluttering shut. She prayed. Prayed that the guardians would find her. Or better yet, that Vasper would be the one to see her first. Meanwhile, Vasper stood in his skyscraper, on the top floor of the kingdom of Velantis Noctem, one of the many properties he had inherited from his mother. But unlike the rest of his holdings, whether in the cities of outer world or even in the inner world, he despised crowded buildings. Especially those infested with surveillance cameras. The kingdom of Alexander Mondragon was worse. Every street, every corner of the city was under constant watch. There was no escape from the ever-seeing eyes of his regime. Even in this very building, Vasper's own property, surveillance cameras were everywhere, except for two places. His office. And his bedroom. Now, Vasper was already dressed in a sleek, all-black formal suit. He sat in his chair, facing the entrance to his office, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest in calculated rhythm. In front of him, on the desk, were two notes. One for Havana. And one for Vladimir. He had summoned both mother and son to his office, but truthfully, he only needed Havana. She knew the locations of Alexander Mondragon's hideouts. And Vasper needed that information now. Because despite searching for hours, despite using every advanced technology at his disposal, Chanty was nowhere to be found. Not her. Not Alexander Mondragon. And with each passing hour, the unease in his chest tightened its grip. Yes, the prophecy of the Sword of Destiny had shown him a vision. Chanty would defeat Alexander Mondragon. But a prophecy alone wasn't enough to ease the dread clawing at his heart. Not until he saw it with his own eyes. He knew the kind of power Alexander possessed. Even if it was weakened during the 9-hour window, Vasper couldn't afford to be complacent. Especially knowing Alexander's growing interest in Chanty. It was almost ironic. What was happening now was exactly what he had once done to Alexander. Back then, consumed by rage over his mother's death, Vasper had sought revenge in the cruelest way possible, by taking the women Alexander replaced his mother with. Havana included. And he had been right. Havana was obsessed with him. All because Vasper had once given her a taste, just one night in his bed. But that one night turned into 6. 6 nights of secrecy, of affairs that happened right here, in this very building, inside his own bedroom. But after it all, Vasper had made a decision. He left. He abandoned the inner world and chose to live permanently in outer world. Because he was tired. Tired of playing with women. Including Zalora and the others. Tired of meaningless pleasure. He had even taken women from his own father, and yet he felt no regret. None. Because, to Vasper, that was justice. It was the only way he could avenge his mother, the only woman who had ever loved Alexander Mondragon. And now, fate had turned the game against him. Because this time, it was his father who wanted his woman. Don Lorenzo. A bitter laugh escaped Vasper's lips. Life had a cruel sense of irony. Everything he had once done in the past was now coming back to strike him like a slap to the face. But it didn't matter. He could endure whatever punishment fate had in store. The only thing he couldn't endure was losing Chanty. Everything else could be taken from him, but not her. Never her. His thoughts were shattered when he felt it. A presence. Havana. But Vladimir was not with her. Vasper's jaw clenched, his fists curling tight. That guy. He already knew Vladimir had no loyalty to him, only to Alexander. Vladimir was still young. 28 years old, his real age. Born after Vasper had already left for outer world, conceived while Havana remained behind. And Vasper knew exactly what Vladimir wanted. To be the heir. To take the place Vasper had held since the beginning. But that was impossible. Because Vasper had been the chosen heir from the start. Because Vasper carried almost all of Alexander's features, not just that. He also surpassed the expectations of the High Council of the entire kingdom. He looked like his father's twin, except for one thing. His eyes. The only thing he had inherited from his mother. Vasper exhaled sharply. He had wanted Vladimir here to keep Havana in check. Her obsession with him was dangerous, and their past affair was the kind of secret that could never be exposed. With Vladimir present, Havana would have been forced to behave. But now, a sharp voice broke through his device, making his gaze flicker toward his desk. Havana, he muttered, watching the monitor. There she was. Outside his door. She had come with 3 elven guards. Dressed seductively. Every curve, every asset was on full display, flaunted like an invitation. Vasper let out a bitter laugh. She was expecting something to happen. Again. Behind her, 3 elven guards stood like silent shadows. But with a mere flick of her fingers, Havana dismissed them, signaling for them to wait outside the building. Without question, they obeyed. Vasper's expression remained cold as he watched her through the security screen mounted on the wall beside his door. Her impatience was written all over her face. She knocked. Once. Twice. Then she called his name. Vasper. Open this door. What's taking you so long? Her voice rang out in the language of Velantis. Vasper didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the screen. This woman. This was the woman Alexander had used to replace his mother? The thought disgusted him. Slowly, his eyes flicked toward the clock. Vladimir still hadn't arrived. He had planned to wait. To delay. To make her suffer outside the door a little longer. But then, with a sharp inhale, he stood. Without warning, he strode toward the door, gripping the handle. And in one swift motion, he threw it open. The moment the door swung wide, Havana wasted no time. She stepped forward. No. She rushed inside. Faster than Vasper had anticipated. Before he could react, she spun around, shoving the door closed behind her in a single, forceful motion. The speed of it took Vasper off guard, his expression hardening as he watched her. She smirked. And he clenched his fists. And in an instant, Havana wrapped her arms around Vasper's neck, capturing his lips hungrily as she stripped off her dress in one swift motion. The fabric pulled at her feet. Vasper was momentarily silent, stunned by Havana's desperate move, like a ravenous lion attacking its prey. This was a familiar scene between them. Always rushed, always urgent, always desperate. That was how they had hidden their affair. Until both of them reached their peak. But this time, Vasper grabbed Havana's arms and forcefully removed them from his neck. With a firm push, he shoved her back, snatching up her discarded dress, a delicate garment, barely more than a whisper of lace. He tossed it back to her. Havana, shocked, caught the dress midair, her lips slightly parted in disbelief. Get dressed, Havana. Vladimir is on his way. Vasper's voice was relaxed, but his tone was icy cold. Havana felt the sting of his rejection. Insulted, she narrowed her eyes at him. Why, she scoffed. You don't want me? You're not in the mood? Then, with a seductive smirk, she teased, we can do it even if I just sit here on the desk. She said it in their native tongue, her voice dripping with temptation, her eyes burning with desire. But Vasper only looked at her, his expression unreadable. I'm not in the mood, Havana. His tone was final. I called you here because I need information. As she slipped her dress back on, Havana never took her eyes off him. Her brow arched, a teasing smile playing on her lips. She was still thinking about all the things she wanted to do to him in that moment. But Vasper ignored her completely. Where is Alexander's desert? His voice was direct, unwavering. I know there's a hidden desert here in Velantis, one where he's planted devices to keep it invisible from any locator systems. I need to know how to get in. Havana burst into laughter. Vasper. Why, she mocked. You never cared about Velantis before. Why the sudden interest in this desert? There are deserts outside the wall, aren't there? What makes this one so special? Sarcasm dripped from her voice as she sauntered toward the desk, sitting down with her legs slightly parted, an open invitation for him. A signal. A dare. But Vasper didn't move. Didn't even flinch. He refused to be tempted. Even with her sitting right in front of him, barely clad, her thin underwear leaving nothing to the imagination. It's not important for you to know my reasons, Havana. His voice was sharp. Just give me the information. I know you have it. Havana chuckled, shaking her head. Of course, Vasper, I know. But I won't tell you. Not unless you take me to heaven first. Her voice was a sultry whisper, her every movement laced with seduction. Havana. Vasper's voice dropped, dangerously low. Do you know why I called Vladimir here? Havana's smile faltered. Curiosity flashed in her eyes. Why? She asked, suspicion creeping into her tone. Vasper's lips curled into a knowing smile. I want to tell him about our past. I want him to see exactly what kind of woman his mother really is. Havana's entire body stiffened. Her expression twisted into pure shock. In an instant, she shot up from her seat, fury blazing in her eyes as she stormed toward him. Their gazes clashed, equally fierce. Equally unyielding. Where is Alexander's desert? Vasper asked again, his voice devoid of emotion. Havana stood still, her expression dark, her lips pressed into a tight line. Then, just as Vasper sensed Vladimir's presence approaching, he smirked. Your only son is here, he murmured, his voice a chilling whisper. He respects you so much, doesn't he? Holds you in the highest regard. I know how much you value your dignity, Havana. So if I were you, I wouldn't do anything that might make me destroy it. Havana clenched her fists, her anger barely contained. She lifted her hand, ready to slap him. But Vasper caught her wrist midair. Think fast, Havana. I don't have time for this. His patience was razor thin. Just as he reached for the door, the device on his desk beeped. Vladimir's voice rang through the speakers. Vasper's hand was on the doorknob when Havana suddenly grabbed his arm. He stopped, looking down at her. Through clenched teeth, her voice laced with rage, she spat out the location of Alexander's desert. The moment your father returns there, he will finish Chanty off, Vasper. You won't reach her in time. Your father is already weakened. He needs her blood. The sword of destiny has wounded him severely. Vasper's eyes burned with intensity. Without another word, he opened the door. You can leave now, he said coldly. Havana turned, stepping out with a dark expression. Standing in the doorway was Vladimir. Stunned. His eyes widened as he took in his mother's revealing attire. As she passed him, her face unreadable, Vladimir turned to Vasper, confused. But Vasper didn't say a word. He simply shut the door. Vladimir stood there, dumbfounded. His mind raced with questions. What had just happened? Why was his mother dressed like that? Why had Vasper called him here, only to shut him out? Frowning, Vladimir hurried after his mother as she made her way toward the elevator. Mother. What's happening here? His voice was laced with frustration. I don't understand what just happened. Why are you even here? And why are you dressed like that? He paused, his expression darkening. And why did Vasper call me, only to ignore me? That arrogant son of my father, he's such an ass. Bastard. As they descended to the ground floor of Vasper Mondragon's building, Vladimir studied his mother's expression. She was silent. Too silent. It was unsettling. He wanted to ask. to demand answers. But something about her demeanor made him hold his tongue. And so, for the rest of the ride down, neither of them spoke a word. Meanwhile, Chanty opened her eyes, groggy and disoriented. She suddenly sat up and looked around. She was still beneath the shade of the tree, but she had no idea how long she had slept, exhaustion weighing heavily on her body. She turned in slow circles, scanning the vast desert that stretched endlessly in every direction. They must truly be deep in the wilderness. Why hadn't she seen any of the guardians yet? Chanty quickly checked her sapphire and diamond wedding ring, which she had left on a rock nearby. It was still there, exactly where she had placed it, gleaming under the sun's reflection. A wave of thirst and hunger washed over her, her parched throat and empty stomach aching. She could only hope that David would find her soon, especially Jake or Vasper, somewhere out here in the desert. She let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head as she thought about Alexander Mondragon. Coward, she mused. He's probably off somewhere, tending to his wounds after the sword of destiny struck him. Chanty approached a small pond, its crystal-clear water shimmering like a liquid jewel, almost teasing her as the dryness in her throat intensified. She knelt beside the pond, cupping her hands to drink, savoring the cool relief against her burning thirst. As she gazed at the water, ripples suddenly distorted her reflection, revealing Alexander Mondragon standing right behind her, smiling. Chanty gasped and instinctively jumped back, her wide eyes locking onto Alexander. His attire had changed. He now wore regal black and gold clothing, designed for combat. If not for his crimson eyes, she could have mistaken him for Vasper. Their hair was different too. Alexander's was longer, tied back into a high ponytail. She wiped her wet lips with the back of her hand, her heart pounding like a war drum. But before she could move, Alexander struck. In the blink of an eye, he was behind her, wrapping his arms around her in an unyielding embrace. A sudden force spun her around, and before she could even gasp, his lips crashed against hers in a desperate, consuming kiss. Chanty felt the soft press of his lips against hers, yet her mind screamed in defiance. Her body refused to obey. She couldn't move, couldn't resist. Her lips parted slightly, and Alexander seized the opportunity, his tongue delving into the depths of her mouth, claiming her with relentless hunger. She froze, paralyzed. The very breath Alexander exhaled carried a hypnotic spell, rendering anyone who inhaled it utterly powerless. She felt weightless, as if she were floating, her body betraying her while her mind remained fully aware. A sharp pain bloomed on her lips. Alexander was drinking her blood. His hungry mouth, starved for the life force that would restore his strength, pulled her essence through the kiss. Chanty could feel her energy slipping away, draining into Alexander like a river flowing into an endless abyss. "Move, Chanty, move," she screamed within her own mind, but her body refused to obey. She felt herself growing weaker, her limbs trembling as her strength was siphoned away. "Vasper! Help!" she cried out in her thoughts. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move. Alexander's grip only tightened around her, locking her in his unrelenting embrace. "Don't worry," Alexander murmured against her lips, his voice dripping with dark amusement. "I'll leave you with just enough blood to survive, my future queen." Chanty shuddered. Weren't vampires supposed to bite their victims on the neck to drink their blood? Why was Alexander drawing it from her lips instead? And why did it feel like he was siphoning something more than just her blood, something deeper, something essential to her very soul? Suddenly, a vision flooded Chanty's mind. She saw her life flash before her, from childhood. "He's reading my memories." Realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. She heard the deep, guttural groan of pleasure rumbling from Alexander's chest as he kissed her, as if savoring not only her blood but the emotions, the secrets, the very essence of her being. And then she saw them, her mother and father. Tears welled in her eyes as the memories washed over her. She saw the love, the devotion, the warmth of a family that once cradled her existence. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Alexander, sensing her distress, only tightened his embrace, pulling her impossibly closer. The air between them grew thinner, suffocating beneath the weight of his hold. The visions continued, flashing like a reel of film, until they reached the moment of her mother's death. The pain of that memory ignited something deep within Chanty, a raw, searing force. No! A scream tore from her throat as an explosion of strength surged through her. With every ounce of willpower, she shoved Alexander away. At that moment, something within her awakened. Her entire being trembled as a transformation overtook her. In her right hand, the sword of destiny materialized, its radiant light flaring like the sun itself. The sapphire wedding ring, resting on a nearby rock, responded to the sword's presence, glowing with an unearthly brilliance. Alexander burst into laughter. Triumphant. Even if only for a moment, he had tasted Chanty's blood and felt his power return. The wounds that once marred his body had vanished. He licked his lips, savoring the lingering taste of her essence, his crimson eyes gleaming with satisfaction. His gaze settled on Chanty. A sinister smile played on his lips. But something had changed. This was no longer the same Chanty who had stood before him mere moments ago. This was the shadow of the sword. The sword of destiny was just as hungry as Alexander himself, only its thirst was for his blood. Alexander wiped the last trace of her blood from his lips with the back of his hand, watching her closely. He could see it, the way her posture shifted, the way the shadows twisted around her form. She was no longer just Don Lorenzo. The sword had taken hold of her. The bearer of the sword of destiny. Alexander mused, his smirk widening. More tempting than anything. If he drank more of her blood, not just from her lips, but from her neck, he could gain another 1,000 years of power. The prophecy was true. He could already feel the intoxicating effects coursing through his veins. But then, another thought slithered into his mind. If simply tasting her blood felt this exhilarating, how much greater pleasure would he experience if he had her beneath him in bed? No wonder Vasper Mondragon was obsessed with her. Even now, the softness of Chanty's lips lingered on Alexander's mouth, the taste of her essence burned into his tongue. His wicked grin remained as he traced his fingers over his stomach, where his wounds had miraculously healed. He had no healing abilities at the moment. Yet, he was completely restored. His laughter echoed through the vast desert. Before him stood the elixir of immortality, Don Lorenzo. But his laughter was abruptly cut short. Without a word, Chanty attacked. Like a bolt of lightning, she lunged at him. Alexander was just as fast, his sword unsheathed in an instant to block her strike. His movements were precise. He didn't want her wounded. He couldn't afford to spill a single drop of her precious blood. But Chanty didn't hesitate. She struck again, her blade moving like a flash of divine fury. The clash of their sword echoed through the desert, sending dust and debris swirling into the sky. Alexander could feel it, his body surging with strength, his energy fully restored. Once again, he shoved Chanty backward. But before he could even blink, she was already in front of him. The sword of destiny hungered for his blood. Alexander teleported a short distance away. But Chanty was relentless. She pursued him like a shadow, her speed inhuman, her blade a streak of silver light. He watched her with fascination. One thing was certain, he couldn't let her get too close. Not while the shadow of the sword was in control. The moment he neared her, the sword of destiny flared to life, its hunger insatiable. It wanted his blood. Alexander smirked. This was going to be fun. Chanty attacked once more, but this time, her strategy had changed. Alexander no longer let his guard down. He had learned his lesson. Yet, despite his sharp instincts and centuries of combat experience, he struggled to block her relentless strikes. The sword of destiny had read his every movement, making his defenses falter. Then, without warning, Chanty's attack shifted, she struck. The clash of their swords was deafening, like thunder splitting the sky, each impact flashing with blinding sparks. Alexander barely dodged her final blow, but it wasn't enough. The tip of the sword of destiny drove into his left shoulder, piercing clean through to his back. The searing pain ripped through him, white-hot and merciless. Gritting his teeth, he staggered backward, trying to minimize the blade's penetration. He teleported, retreating rapidly, but Chanty was always there, right in front of him, pressing the sword deeper into his wound. Their eyes met. Both burned with unyielding determination, locked in an unspoken battle of wills. But Chanty's face held only one expression: resolve. She was going to end him. The sword of destiny drank hungrily from Alexander Mondragon's wound, devouring his blood. Not a single drop touched the desert sands. It was all absorbed by the blade, pulsing with a crimson glow. Alexander's body weakened. He could feel his very essence being drained, his strength siphoned into the sword. Desperate, he flicked his free hand toward Chanty, attempting to strike her down with his telekinesis. But nothing happened. She didn't even flinch. His power had no effect on her. His teeth clenched. The venomous burn of the sword of destiny had already spread to his bones. A growl of agony tore from his throat. In a final act of desperation, Alexander swung his crystal sword at the blade, impaling him. Sparks exploded, and though the force of his strike wrenched the sword of destiny free from his shoulder, the motion only worsened his wound. Blood gushed from the gaping injury. Still, he didn't hesitate. With the last of his energy, Alexander teleported, hurling himself far into the distance. He didn't waste a second. He knew Chanty would chase him. And he wasn't strong enough to face her again. Not yet. The moment Alexander's presence disappeared from the desert, the shadow of the sword abandoned Chanty's body. The sword of destiny vanished from her grasp. And the exhaustion hit her like a collapsing mountain. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the burning sand, a deep groan escaping her lips. Her body ached, every muscle, every joint, every nerve screamed in pain. The sheer effort of battle had drained her completely. She tried to rise. Failed. Gritting her teeth, she crawled forward, dragging herself inch by inch toward the shade of a lone tree. The scorching heat of the sand seared her palms, knees, and feet. If this continued, if Alexander and the shadow of the sword kept tormenting her like this, she was going to die here. Her stomach twisted with hunger. How long had it been? Hours? Days? She had no idea. Finally, she reached the tree's base and collapsed against its trunk. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she forced herself forward, towards the nearby pond. The moment her fingers touched the cool water, she scooped it to her face, splashing it over her skin before bringing it to her lips. The relief was instant. As the water trickled down her throat, her mind cleared slightly, and for the first time, she noticed something. The wound she had inflicted on Alexander. A deep wound. It had pierced straight through his shoulder. He was surely tending to it now, healing himself. But something puzzled her. Throughout their battle, Alexander had only defended himself. He hadn't tried to kill her. Why? When would this fight end? A sigh escaped her lips, relief mingled with frustration. At least, for now, no one else had been caught in their war. Then, panic. Her gaze snapped toward the stone where she had left the wedding ring. It was gone. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she scrambled to her feet, searching frantically. Had it been thrown during the fight? Had it been buried beneath the dust and debris of their battle? Her fingers tore through the sand, overturning rocks, scanning every inch of the ground. Nothing. She traced their battlefield, moving farther and farther from the tree until she reached an area where the sand was fine, untouched by the jagged stones. And there, amidst the glistening grains, something sparkled. Her breath caught. The wedding ring. Lying in the sand, its sapphire gem catching the sunlight. Relief crashed over her. She hadn't lost it. She bent down, carefully retrieving it, her fingers brushing against the warm metal. Good. At least one thing remained in her grasp. She swiftly picked up the ring, wiping it with her trembling fingers. A symbol of the past. A relic of what once was. Jake. A tear threatened to slip from her eye, but she wiped it away before it could fall. As she turned back toward the tree, something in the distance caught her attention. A figure. Her body tensed instantly. Who? It couldn't be Alexander. Could it? She wasn't sure. She never knew what tricks Alexander Mondragon had up his sleeve. Her senses sharpened. Every muscle in her body went on high alert. Her eyes remained locked on the approaching silhouette, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Then, her breath hitched. The moment his presence reached her, she knew. Jake. Jake Valerian. Her lips parted in a stunned gasp as recognition slammed into her. It was him. Relief and disbelief surged through her in a dizzying wave. A breathless laugh escaped her lips. She had been found. The Guardians had found her. But where were the others? Why was Jake alone? Before she could even process her thoughts, Jake teleported, appearing right in front of her. Her breath caught. His face. So close. And before she could say a word, he pulled her into his arms. Tightly. Desperately. My love, Jake's voice was thick with emotion. Thank the gods, I finally found you. I've been searching for you. He held her even tighter. I thought I lost you. Chanty broke. Tears spilled down her face as she clung to him. Yes. Jake, thank you, you found me, but her voice trembled. Why did it take so long? How long have I been waiting? Her body shook against his, overwhelmed by exhaustion and relief. Jake cupped her face in both hands, his palms warm and grounding. His forehead rested against hers. Then, his gaze drifted downward. His expression darkened. His thumb brushed across her bottom lip, where a cut had formed. Dried blood stained her cheek. His jaw tightened. He stepped back, his sharp eyes scanning her. From the dirt-streaked boots on her feet to the wind-swept strands of hair tangled with grains of sand. And yet, despite the battle scars, despite the exhaustion weighing her down, she was still breathtaking. Still Chanty. His Chanty. Was this Alexander Mondragon's doing? His voice was low, deadly. His fingers brushed over a wound on her lip. He wanted to kiss it. Heal it. But he held himself back. Chanty nodded. Tears slipped from her eyes as she told him everything. Everything that had happened in the desert. How she had arrived. How she had fought. How she had nearly won. Jake listened in silence. His lips pressed into a hard line. Then, without a word, he pulled her back into his arms. And held her. Tightly. As if he could shield her from everything. Don't worry. His voice was firm. Steady. I'm here now. We'll finish this fight together. You're not alone, my love. Chanty sobbed into his chest, clutching his shirt. Then, Jake gently pried open her fingers. And took the ring from her palm. With careful precision, he slid it back onto her finger. Don't take this off again. His voice was soft, but commanding. Keep it here. Always. His thumb brushed over the sapphire, lingering as he held her hand. Then, his eyes returned to hers. Come. His voice was filled with concern. Let's go back to the tent. You need food. I can see it in your face, you're exhausted. But Chanty shook her head. No, Jake. Her voice was unwavering. I won't go back. I have to wait here for Alexander. Jake's expression darkened. If I return to the tent, more people will get involved in this battle, and I won't let that happen. Her hands clenched into fists. I almost had him, Jake. I almost killed him. But he escaped. My sword struck his shoulder instead of his heart. Determination blazed in her eyes. The next time he returns, I'll make sure he doesn't escape. Jake exhaled slowly, his gaze locked onto hers. Chanty. She met his stare, unwavering. I know he'll come back once he's healed. The sword of destiny has venom, just like the crystal sword. She clenched her jaw. He's in pain, Jake. His power is weaker while he's recovering. He won't be able to heal as fast as before. Her fists tightened. And when he returns... A cold fire burned in her eyes. I'll finish this. Only a few more hours, and his true power will return. He is powerful. Do not underestimate him, my love. Do not give him a chance. Jake whispered these words while embracing Chanty. She allowed him to hold her, letting the warmth of his arms wrap around her. Can you hold me too? Jake pleaded, his voice filled with longing. Chanty, moved by his words, returned his embrace. But as they pulled away from each other, a sudden force erupted, a burst of energy. Jake staggered back. Chanty's eyes widened in shock as she saw it. A lightning arrow had pierced through Jake's chest. His body stiffened, his eyes glowing as he looked at Chanty, then at the arrow embedded in the left side of his chest. He had been struck, his heart had taken the hit. No. Jake. Chanty screamed, throwing herself at him. Tears streamed down her face as she held Jake's weakening body, his weight pressing down on her as he collapsed onto the sand. Chanty fell with him, still clinging to him as if holding on could somehow keep him alive. Jake tried to speak, but blood trickled from his lips. No words came out. He could only gaze at her with half-lidded eyes. With his last ounce of strength, he raised his trembling hand, reaching for her cheek. The sun blazed mercilessly above them, its heat and light unbearable. Chanty cradled Jake's head, shielding him from the scorching sun with her own body. She looked down at his face resting in her arms. Jake, please, don't die, she sobbed, her voice breaking with despair. The arrow, like a bolt of lightning, remained lodged in his chest. But Jake could no longer respond. Jake. No. Please, don't leave me. My love, I love you. I'm so sorry. Please, don't leave me. Chanty wailed over and over, her cries piercing through the barren desert. She did not notice the shadowy figure watching her from a distance. Alexander Mondragon stood there, a smirk playing on his lips. Jake smiled weakly at Chanty one last time, but his eyes were barely open now. Then, he closed them. His final breath escaped his lips. His hand fell lifelessly to the ground. Chanty gasped, her entire world shattering in an instant. No. She screamed, her voice raw with agony. She clutched Jake's body, pressing herself against him as if she could force life back into him. This was her husband, the man who had loved her unconditionally, yet she had never truly returned that love the way he deserved. Jake. She cried again and again, rocking his half-lifeless body in her arms, sinking into the burning sand. She wept for a long time, her heart heavy with sorrow. She traced his face with trembling fingers, unable to accept the truth. David. She cried out for help desperately. Get us out of this desert. Jake. She still held him, still clung to the lifeless body that no longer housed his soul. Memories of their time together flooded her mind, stabbing into her like knives. I'm so sorry, for everything. Jake. She whispered, her voice broken. Then, something strange happened. The arrow in Jake's chest began to glow. Chanty watched in disbelief as it slowly disappeared, fading into nothing. But as the arrow vanished, Jake's body also began to dissolve into thin air. No, no. No. Chanty screamed, watching helplessly as his form was carried away by the wind, leaving only his clothes behind. His wedding ring tumbled onto the sand. Chanty, blinded by grief, reached for it with shaking hands. Tears blurred her vision as she picked it up, clutching it tightly. She grabbed his shirt, what was left of him, and held it close, sobbing uncontrollably into the fabric. Even his combat shoes, she held them too, refusing to let go, as if doing so would mean truly losing him forever. Jake. Jake. She whispered his name like a prayer. For a long time, she wept, her body racked with sorrow, until exhaustion drained the tears from her. She could barely breathe, barely move. But then, something shifted inside her. No. She couldn't break down now. She couldn't let his death be in vain. She knew who was responsible. Alexander. A sharp, seething rage ignited within her. Chanty felt his presence behind her. Her sorrow turned into something else, something dark, something dangerous. Silence. She wiped her tears. She clenched Jake's shirt in her lap, her fingers digging into the fabric before she rose to her feet. Rage gave her strength. Rage gave her purpose. She turned. There he was. Alexander stood tall, smiling at her, his eyes filled with amusement. She was filled with grief and fury, he was filled with arrogance and wicked delight. Then, without a sound, the sword of destiny materialized in Chanty's hand. Alexander's smirk deepened. He looked at the sword and chuckled. He wanted her blood, her very essence, to restore his power and heal his wounds. But the sword wanted something just as badly. It wanted his blood. It wanted his life. The battle between them was inevitable. But Alexander had to strike first, before the true power of the sword awakened, before the shadows of the blade consumed Chanty completely. "I'm sorry about what happened to Jake," Alexander said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "But it was all his fault. He meddled where he shouldn't have. He was ambitious. He wanted to steal my queen." His voice was soft, but every word stabbed into Chanty like a dagger. Her fists clenched, her grip on the sword tightening. Tears welled up in her eyes once more, but this time, they were not tears of grief. They were tears of rage. She did not answer him. She simply clenched her jaw, grinding her teeth in fury. Alexander stood proudly, his posture regal, his gaze locked onto hers. Their eyes met, challenging, burning, unyielding. For a brief moment, silence reigned. The desert wind howled, sweeping through their hair, her ponytail whipping behind her, his dark locks stirring in the heat. Alexander watched her with amusement, his smirk widening. He was proud. Proud that this fierce, broken woman would be his queen. "Don't worry, my future queen," he murmured. "Together, we will rule both the inner world and the outer world. Nothing will stop us. I will give you everything. Even this entire universe. The kingdoms will bow before you. You will be queen of this world." He paused, his golden eyes gleaming. "All you have to do is stay by my side." His voice was smooth, filled with promises. But Chanty did not waver. She would not bow. She would never bow. Because now, she had only one purpose. Vengeance.